Hey everybody, it is Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Welcome. Hopefully you are here for a virtual roundtable from the Communications Network about vulnerability in communications. We're going to have that conversation with our good friend, Dr. Georgette Legister, in just a minute. I'm going to yak at you for a quick second as the room is filling up, as we often do, just to make space for everybody to come in. And if you are hearing a beautiful voice in the background, I am not a ventriloquist. That's Angelique Kidjo. And that is my friend JoJo's special request. This is her cover of the song Summertime. So just listen to it along with me. Beautiful, beautiful rendition. While we are coming into the room, a couple just pieces of housekeeping. If you've been with us before, you know what I'm about to say. I'm going to say it anyway. Take your finger or your mouse or whatever you use to manipulate your computer, go down to the bottom. And then when you hover, what you'll see is a little black band kind of pop up on the screen there. And we're all becoming Zoom experts, right? Go ahead and click on the chat function, and then as you do that, what you probably see is if it's like me, it's preloaded and it says all panelists. Make sure that you have it set to say all panelists and attendees, so we can talk to everybody, because this is a community gathering, right? It's not meant to be just us yakking at you, although you're gonna have to indulge me for a minute, but we want to be able to talk to each other. So if you would, first things first, let's all, as we're gathering in, just go ahead and type in that chat box. Just say hi. I'm gonna say it's Sean. And hey, Joseph, how are you? And then Brene Brown does this really cool thing that we started doing last time. I think it's probably helpful, just kind of especially now. And that's this thing that she's introduced called the 2-minute, or the 2-word check-in. So, hey, Johanna, how are you? Philip, how are you, my friend? Amanda, lovely to see you. Suzanne, how are you? Susan in Chicago, how are you? Megan, Mandy, how are you, my friends? Jen, lovely to see you. Oh, kind of, right? I'm not actually, guess I'm seeing you. But that 2-word check-in, let's go ahead and put that in too. What are the 2 words describe kind of how you're feeling right now? So I'm feeling kind of happy and joyful. And, you know, hope that doesn't insult anybody. That's just kind of my mood right now. Jen's in cleaning mode. Those are good 2 words. You should come to my house. It's been amazing. Live with 2 little people. We clean, and then immediately it's just like, it looks like Kansas after the storm blew through in Wizard of Oz. Surprisingly okay. That's excellent, Suzanne. That's great. And it's Earth Day. Happy Earth Day. You're making my wife happy. Yeah. So continue coming. Doretta, how are you? And how are you doing? Feeling good. Great, Kim. I'm happy to hear it. Tired, but loving the music and the company. I'm so down for that. Oh, that's Georgette. That's you. Okay. It's only Wednesday. Carrie, it's Tuesday again. It's been Tuesday for like a month and a half, right? And frankly, we're among the very fortunate ones, right? It's probably worth being mindful of all the folks who are out on the front lines, and many, many people are out there trying to find their way, and others who are really scared because it's been a month or more maybe without a paycheck. Proud and thankful. There you go. Who said that? Andre, wonderful. Refreshed and content. Good. That's a great way to be honest. Okay, so let's keep putting that in, and let's also make sure that we're giving ourselves the practice of chit-chatting with one another. If you've seen something recently that's interesting, this chat is for you, for us as a community. So share some ideas or things that you found that are inspiring to you. Hey, Kelly. Hey, Jennifer. How are you? Michelle, how are you? You guys are going too fast again. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Oh, and there's the other thing I should tell you. Our friend and colleague, Carrie Klein, she's up in New Jersey, sheltering with her family. She is taking notes while we're underway here. So when this is over, we always record these. This will be available up on YouTube. It will also, those notes will be available on comnetwork.org, and we'll share all that out with you in very short order. So just give us, 24, 48 hours, and we'll have that available to you. Our colleague, Yabby Ferris, as she always does, is taking notes on Twitter right now, live. So she will be, if you want to find out what she's notating along the way, go ahead and go to the hashtag ComNetLive, COMNETLIVE on Twitter, and you'll be able to, she always puts the highlights up as well, so you can find all of that online a little bit later on. So thanks to them. And then my partner in crime, Tristan Mahabir, is down in Florida right now, where I am sure it's quite warm and lovely. He is running the slide deck. So if you would, Mr. T, take us to the next slide. I'm going to give you a couple quick heads ups or flag a few things for you, and then hand it right over to my friend JoJo. And we are, by the way, in for an enormous treat. She has quickly become one of my favorite people. She's extraordinary. So you don't want to hear from me much more. All right, so just this one thing I want to tell you about. Chances are you know about this, but let me just point you to it again. With your help and with the help of a lot of really great, wonderful, generous people, we have built this collaborative communications or crisis communications triage kit. It's free, it's open to everybody. Share it widely. It's been really, really helpful from what we understand, and it's getting better because everybody's contributing to it. Kind of 2 pieces to it. One is sort of a guide It's based on a lot of the recommendations from the CDC and others about crisis communication. So you can avail yourself of that. And then there's also a really cool Google spreadsheet that we made that literally has just examples of people who've done pieces of communications work that you can take and borrow from. There's no plagiarism. If you need something, you find something that kind of fits your needs, and you want to just sort of scrape all the written information off there and swap in your name or swap out somebody else's name, that's cool. I wouldn't say that. I probably won't say that in 18 months, but right now, given the situation we're in, that is totally okay. And Carrie's putting all those links in right now. So that's the other thing you can look to, is these links will be in the chat just now. Mr. T, if you'll take it forward. It's the other thing I want to talk to you about. I'm going to do this really fast. There's a new program we have. If you've been with us, you've been hearing me talk about this for goodness, feels like forever, probably back when I still had dark hair. But the Circles program is going to be happening in very, very short order. And the idea is pretty simple. We know the network's gotten big. There's 2,500 of us now gathering from around the globe, which is beautiful and cool. But it's also true that maybe that makes it a little bit harder to find exactly the right people. So the premise of Circles is pretty simple. We're going to connect you to the people who are either working on the same kinds of issues that you are. So let's say that you're working on social justice. We know there's tons of people doing that within the network across the globe. Let's create a dedicated space for you all to gather. That's what Circles is about. Or the other theory is maybe you have a specific kind of responsibility or role or function within your organization. You're the digital director, or you do speech writing, or you're the VP or director, or whoever it is managing the department. It's also sometimes helpful just talk to other people who have those responsibilities, but in other organizations, to find out how it works outside the four walls where you are. So Circles will help to connect you deliberately through that. And so there'll be more coming on that in very, very short order. Okay, with that, I think that's all I need to kind of to throw at you. Mr. T, if you will take it forward, I think it's now my pleasure and honor to introduce you all to someone who you were about to fall in love with. Andre gets to go first, but the rest of us can be in line behind him. Dr. I can't speak now. See, I can't spit. I almost got there, and then I blew it. Dr. Georgette, she goes by JoJo Legister, and she's coming to us from Atlanta. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a little human within shouting distance of her. So you may hear that along the way, but that's cool because that's how we roll these days. All right, gang, let's go. Georgette, JoJo, you want to take it away?
Yeah, hi everyone. Again, many thanks to Sean and to Carrie and Tristan and the rest of the ComNet team for this amazing opportunity, and to Dre, who is my baby daddy, and who's also on this call. I just wanted to be guaranteed one person that RSVP that would actually log on, and so Dre was my mandatory one. But it's exciting to be here and just to make time to connect with one another during these really tense, anxiety-ridden times. So welcome to you all, and we're just gonna get started. Before we go to the next slide, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I am originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo. French is my first language. And Sean, I like to do this a lot, and my colleagues accuse me of showing off. And they're not wrong, but English is neither my first, second, third, or fourth language. And so if
that's showing off, dude. That's that English comes in fifth. As you can tell, I can barely spit it out, and it's my first language. I'm gonna shut up now.
Thank you, DeQuindre. I love it too. Yeah, so I just like to kick it off just like that, to just kind of drop that little nugget there. But it's exciting to be here. My grandmother never lived to see the age of 30. And so to see, you know, her third grandchild being on something as amazing as the Communications Network virtual roundtable, you know, it's giving me the feels here. And she feels like she's with me today. So I'm the executive director of Fearless Dialogues, and Fearless Dialogues is an organization out of Atlanta, Georgia, where I currently am. That specializes in creating unique spaces where unlikely partners gather and have hard and heartfelt conversations around difficult subjects. And we've done this work with over 35,000 leaders in the past 6.5 years. We're only 7 years old. So it's been a pleasure to be able to do work that means a lot to us. It was founded by Dr. Greg Ellison down at Emory University, also in Atlanta, Georgia. And it's been one of, I think, the most exciting endeavors and difficult endeavors of my life. And my joy today is to share with you what exactly we mean by creating a unique space where we can have a heartfelt encounter. Couple things. So Fearless Dialogues, we deal in the experiential. And although I am a professor, I will not go about this the typical academic pedagogical way. We're going to engage our senses. And I don't know if you saw in the invitation, I requested that you all grab 2 sheets of paper. In the US, it's 8.5. Mine is 8.5 by 11, but it's pretty much anything that you can fold. And if you have a notebook, I think Sean has a notebook, go ahead and tear out 2 pieces out of that. Amanda says showing off is fine. Thank you, boo. I will continue to do so just for you. So we will go through what we call at Fearless Dialogues an experiment. When we're invited into contexts with leaders, whether they are communicators like yourselves, whether they are corporate executives, in banking, whatever industry or sector they might be in, whether they're middle school students. One of the very first, one of the first things that we have to keep in mind as Fearless Dialogues animators is that there's a lot of fear and uncertainty about what exactly we're going to do. And so we invite folks into a space that we call a laboratory of discovery. The physical space that we're inhabiting, the digital space that we're on right now at Zoom, I propose to you is now a lab. And just as in any laboratory, sometimes, as Greg Ellison likes to say, some things have to break down or blow up in order to get to a breakthrough. So channel your imagination here and let's enter into this space of experimentation. Our experiment of the day is called 4 Roles, 1 Goal. Mr. T, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Our experiment is called 4 Roles, 1 Goal. All right, so if you'll take one of the sheets of paper and fold it in half horizontally, and then try to crease it as best you can. Carefully crease it. So it's gonna look like this. And then open it up and then fold it lengthwise. Crease it really well down the middle. It's gonna look like this. And so when you open it up, you'll have 4 quadrants. So in those quadrants, grab a pen, a writing utensil. We seem to have a lot of crayons and chalk around here. It's like a trip hazard in our house since we've become homeschool teachers and not very good ones. Grab a pen and number each of those quadrants, starting from the top left quadrants, 1 through 4. So if you can see mine, I don't know if you can see it from there. I've numbered all of them, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 number in each quadrant. And then this is gonna be my first question to you. What are your 4 most important roles that you inhabit? Those roles that make you who you are, that are important to you, that you most resonate with. And if you would write them in these quadrants in order of importance. Your 4 most important roles. And actually, Sean and I would love to see, Joseph is asking whether these are work related. They could be, right? If it's important to you, yeah, it works. So your 4 most important roles. And let's actually hear from you all in the chat. What's your number 1 most important role? So my number 1, Dre, don't get mad at me, it's mother. Yeah. I see father, daughter, mother, Amanda, mom for me too, human. Oh yeah, artist, yeah. Dre says husband. Don't be mad, babe, don't be mad. Friend, child of God, sounding board. No, you did the right thing, Jen. Sounding board, community member. Dre is smart. Yes, he is. Hype woman. Yes. Awesome. Okay. So you have your 4 roles. And if you want to keep typing them in to share your most important role with us, please go ahead and do that. So now what I'd like you to do is along these creases, I want you to tear up this paper along the creases so you're left with 4 boxes. So separate them very carefully and I move through life at a really rapid pace. So I have to like tell myself to slow down and do things. And so if you're anything like me, you want to go through this quickly, but I actually want you to pause and consider what you're doing as you're tearing this piece of paper. Sometimes if you tear it, you can see like fibers pulling away from the paper. I want you to listen to the sound that the paper makes as you tear it. Yeah, I see some fibers. So you should end up with 4 separate sheets of paper. So my number 1, mother. And then I have my other roles. All right. So I'm going to tell you a story. And I'm going to tell you a story of how this situation that we find ourselves in, this forced, imposed upon collective vulnerability has impacted my life. And as we go through this narrative, I want you to tap into your own narrative as well. I want you to reflect, bless you, sweetheart, to reflect about your own roles and to really dig deeply so that this is an experience that we're sharing and not just JoJo's show and tell. So our family began sheltering in place actually a week before almost everyone did. Because our daughter, Zuri, who is 3, got the flu. She got the flu in daycare, and you know, those daycares are like petri dishes. And so we just decided to stay home with her. She's our only kid. We're first-time parents, and so we're super, uber, hyper careful about everything. So we kept her at home. And then, you know, a week later, the shelter-in-place orders came in. And we didn't realize that this baby girl who actually, it took us 7 years to have her. So she's extremely precious to us, as all children are, to those who love them and raise them and care for them. And we want nothing but the best for her. And so, you know, we chose this school after researching it for a long time. And then we were told that she couldn't go back there because it was unsafe for anybody to be out. And so all of a sudden, you know, my number 1 role, mother, which I enter into this part of who I am with all of my being, I enter into it first. It's felt like I'm not able to fully show up as that anymore. Because I can't be mother and homeschool teacher. I am a professor. I am not a good homeschool teacher, y'all. It's a struggle. My daughter's tablet teaches her better than I do. I have moments where I run from her, y'all. I will go in my closet and shut the door. She'd be like, "Mommy," and I'd be like, "Mommy is not home." And so this coronavirus, COVID-19, has put pressure on the part of myself that is a mother. And so I want you all to take your role number 1 and to crumple it up. And to think about the ways in which this pandemic has put pressure on that role number 1. And set it right next to your device, your computer, your tablet, however you're showing up with us today. All right, role number 2, spouse. My husband's sitting right across from me and he's actually online as well. So he's gonna get this in real time 2 ways. We are, very close. You hear those jokes, right? I don't know if you've seen them on social media, that either they're going to be a whole bunch of kids called all kinds of variations of COVID-19 and Corona about a year from now, or divorce courts are going to be very, very busy, right? So it's just this running joke, what are partners and spouses like doing to each other during this time? The sad thing is, I feel like ever since this pandemic has put pressure on our lives, we are working really, really hard to be really good roommates. And we have not been able to take a date night. You can't go anywhere, right? Everything revolves around making sure that we are alive and surviving. And I feel more like Dre's roommate than I feel like Dre's life partner, which is a role that's been important to me. Why? Because we are simply trying to exist and not implode during these Corona days. So this particular role, the second most important role to me, has been put into question and disrupted by the virus. And if you want to share with us, what is your second most important role? And please crumple that up and set that next to your very first ball of paper. I see wife, supporter, daughter, yeah. Gather DC team member, an employee, advisor, writer, editor, partner, daydreamer, that's beautiful. Yeah. Keep those coming. Sean and I will keep an eye on those. All right, role number 3. My third most important role is the role of a daughter, as some of you have listed there. I come from a very large family. I'm originally from Congo. And one of the most difficult things has been not knowing whether or not tomorrow is the day that I will not be able to get across to my family that is not in the States. You read about the different underlying dynamics of this pandemic, the pressure that it's putting on the economy, pressures that it's putting on foreign relations and diplomacy. And I live in this fear that, what if I can't get through to my parents who are in Congo right now? So 70% of my family is abroad. Most of them are in Congo, some of them are in Europe. And so the statistics that you read about what's going on, an ocean away, really, really put pressure on this piece. And, my parents are aging, right? They are getting to the point where I'd like to be able to have them closer, nearer to me. And COVID-19 has put a stop on all of that. I don't even know if they will be able to come visit me in a few months when travel begins again, because of the way that this pandemic is putting pressure on all of our social and political relationships. And so go ahead and type into the chat what your third most important role is. Mine is daughter. And go ahead and crumple that up. Yeah, human. Yeah, woman, family member. Yeah, mentor. Go ahead and post those. Put your third role next to your first and second. And then the last role that I have on mine is educator. So I don't know if you all are connected to anyone in the education system, especially in higher ed. And the major shift that a lot of universities and colleges and K through 12 schools had to do to go online, to keep education going, which on the one hand reveals kind of how behind the 8 ball we were in terms of education. And we thought we integrated technology well enough, but clearly not well enough that we had to completely revamp how we did education in about 7 to 10 days in order to continue to keep the system going. And it's rough, So there's a group, it's called Pandemic Pedagogy Nerds. It's just a bunch of teachers and educators. There are over 30,000 people in that Facebook group. And so we're all trying to share resources on how to keep ourselves going And there's this running joke, in the group, do not do online what you do in the classroom, because it just won't work. And so there's this sense of panic, how is it that we who are supposed to help this system keep going, how are we supposed to do it when we have no idea what we're doing in this new digital space? And so this fourth role that's extremely important, the role of an educator, has really come under fire for me in the last few weeks because of the pandemic. And so why don't you go ahead and put in what your fourth role is as well in the chat, crumple it up and place it next to your first three. Oh, citizen, yeah. Democratic citizen, advocate, professional, PR professional, learner. I like that, Michaela. Yeah, keep those going. We'll keep an eye on them. So now that you have these four roles, I want you to attempt to unfold these pieces of paper. And place them side by side. Friend, I see you, Alex. Mary Jo said worker, yeah. Edith said advocate, yeah. So unfold these sheets of paper and attempt to reconstitute your original sheet of paper. So try to piece them back together as best you can. Resource provider, see you, Violet. Now, unless you have magic, there is no way that your attempt to reconstitute what was before we separated the roles and before we crumpled them up, there's no way that it looks the way it did when we first started out our experiment. And that's because life and crisis, they don't only put pressure on the way that we do our work, but they put pressure on the way that people show up. They put pressure on what matters to us. So, it was a very kind of arbitrary way to do this, but it's also a very visual and helpful way to think about what the human beings behind the work are going through. And that's very important for us at Fearless Dialogues. It's important for us to see the gifts of people who are hidden in plain view. It's important for us to hear the lived experience of those around us. And only when you do those two things, see gifts in people and hear about their lived experience, then can you really do any kind of significant work towards sustainable change. And as communicators, you are putting out these messages that we need to hear. But I thought that it'd be important for us to see you and to hear you. Life post-pandemic will likely not go back to the way that it was. I mean, look at the papers that are sitting right next to you. There is no way. There's no way. However, what we can do is acknowledge the disruption and the pain of the changes, acknowledge how these changes put pressure on us, rip us apart, and really tear us up, literally and figuratively. And then attempt to figure out what's left when all of these roles have been stripped away. What's left? What can we lean on? What can we build forward from? Oh, Tim said, our priorities may change, are reordered by roles after tearing them apart. So even the edges don't and can't match up. That's right. I mean, we can be our best creative selves in trying to reconstitute what was gone, but the result will not be that thing that we lost. And I think it's important to grieve that. And vulnerability is really inviting yourself to share your story, to show the ways in which you are no longer who you were, and you will probably never be that person again. However, something remains. So next question to you. If you have that second sheet of paper, my next question to you is, after all of these roles have been disrupted, stripped away, pressurized, pulverized, what remains? On this second sheet of paper, I want you to draw a circle in the center of the paper. Draw it large enough so that you can actually write in it. And then I want you to write one word to answer the question, after all of those roles have been stripped away, what remains? After all of your roles have been stripped away, what remains? Yeah, Sean said hope. Go ahead and type that in to the chat. What remains for you? Faith, connection, me. I have me too, Claudia. Hope, myself, soul, purpose, a vulnerable being, dreams, contribution, me, self, human, faith, me too, me, yeah. Warrior, I love that. Connection, work with purpose and more meaning. Keep them coming. Resilience, blank canvas, yeah. Shared experience, yeah. I see resilience. That's right, Marty. Alive, seeker, opportunity, love. Keep those coming. So this experiment was inspired by the work of missionaries who did work in South Sudan before South Sudan became that nation. So they were doing work in Khartoum. And they were really, their task was simply to be with these communities that were threatened by war, simply because racism has the effect, when wielded in a particular way, of offering protection to marginalized populations because people are afraid to kill white people. And so these missionaries literally put themselves between warring factions so that these marginalized South Sudanese people would not be killed by the Sudanese army. And so they did what they could to live with, alongside these internally displaced people. And you know, when they came back to the States years later and they were giving this, you know, talk in this class at Emory, they said that they had to contend with, you know, asking people to conceive of a tomorrow when everything that anchored them to today was gone. And so they were talking to people who had valued being a parent, and their whole family was murdered and killed in the war. They were talking to people who were doctors and people who were teachers, and entire schools are bombed out, hospitals are bombed out. And so they learned, and I think the word that was used earlier was resilience by Marty. They learned that truly resilience is not being able to hold on to something indefinitely. Resilience is not even sometimes being able to bounce back from something. Resilience is really, what is the residue? What remains after all of this disruption and this pain? And they learned from these internally displaced peoples and refugees that sometimes you have to reorient your life to not be guided through the roles that you play out, but to reorient your life, to re-anchor your life through what remains at the core of you. That core can never be taken from you. Your roles may change. You know, you may not be the stellar parent that you thought you were when you were attending all the games and when you were making all the snacks, and you're the popular parent in your kid's class, or you know, you're a really good team worker, and you work best when you can look your team in the face and you can have that exchange and that interaction. And now it's just you and Zoom, and you really don't like being in front of a camera. Whatever it is that this pandemic has done to reorient your role, what remains at the core of you can't be taken away from you. And so I want you to take a look at that circle that you drew and that word that you wrote in the center, and to make that your goal through this pandemic. We don't know how long we're going to be in this. We don't know how long it's going to take, but what we do know is that, you know, for JoJo, I have me. I'm here today. And because I'm going to stay at home, shameless plug, stay at home, I will be here at the end of this pandemic. I will be safe. I will wash my hands. I will do what it takes to keep you and me safe. I know that Sean wrote Hope. Can you say a little bit about that, Sean?
Yeah, I guess I try to remind myself, one, we're all getting a good lesson in what deep time looks like. I think it's easy for us to try to gather moments or metrics of time, whether it's a day or an hour or a week or a month, and we're trying to use that to kind of give ourselves some clarity on what the other side of this looks like. This is a natural event. Nobody caused this. This is nature showing up for us in a really ugly way. It's happened before in human history, and it will again. But one of the things I think that my kids and I actually went to a museum. We live in Washington, D.C. We went to the Natural History Museum, and they underwent this amazing renovation over the last 4 or 5 years. The museum's been closed. And when they reopened it, it was all oriented, because it was a natural history museum, it was oriented around this idea of deep time. And I've been kind of fascinated with this idea, because deep time means something that none of us can really grasp as humans. We will never see what deep time really looks like in our lifetimes. The thing that I kind of conjure up to think about is like the Grand Canyon. It didn't arrive in a week. Some water washed across a plain in the Four Corners section of the United States, and over millions of years, this remarkable, extraordinary thing, if you never had a chance to see it, it's amazing. Hey, Zuri, showed up and suddenly is there for us all to marvel at. And even now, it's still being built. But the reason hope comes to mind for me is that it's timeless. It's going to be available to me right now, and it's going to be available to me. It is an idea or a concept that sits with deep time. And I think it's so natural that most of us, because the business and that we're in the do-gooder business. We're trying to be kind and make the world better. And that, I think, is anchored in this optimism or hope. And I just think if you stripped me away, that's just who I am. I have hope.
Yeah, I love that.
And Marty, yeah, Mother Nature's pretty pissed.
Indeed. We were doing this work with a group of bankers who were going through a transition. Their bank had just been bought out, and they were having conversations around branding and rebranding. And, Fearless Dialogues, we are not a marketing firm, right? We are diversity and inclusion educators and trainers. And so the best that we could do was tell them, hey, we can't tell you how to sell yourself, but we can help you to reconnect to what's authentic to yourself. And so if your brand is you, then you can't go wrong, right? So sifting through all the roles that are changing through your job transition, what is the one goal? And what remains at the core? Who are you? And how do you keep that front and center as you transition to this new chapter? So if we can go to the last slide, Tristan. So these are three steps that I want to leave with you, right? Right now, as we are navigating all the variety of difficult layers of what it means to be sheltering in place, how our lives are changing, not just now, but for the foreseeable future, I think it's really important to lean into these moments where we can be vulnerable enough to share our stories. And the first step is to give yourself permission to be vulnerable. Agency is really, really important to me. Being able to make choices about myself, about my life, being able to gain a sense of control. Vulnerability doesn't feel good, but vulnerability also is not really vulnerability if it's imposed on you. That's just exposure. And in many ways, the pandemic has exposed what's broken about our systems, about us. But we can choose to shift from exposure to vulnerability by giving ourselves permission to show up fully and to say, my roles are crumpled up. Like my life feels like these sheets of paper. I'm trying to piece it back together. It's not working. But I'm not the only one going through that. The second step is to take the time to sit with someone else's truth. We've seen the roles that we are all carrying and sharing. We've heard, Sean talk to us about deep time and how this is a concept that we're going to struggle and wrestle with grasping. Because if we're honest, we really want this to be over tomorrow. But we're not ready for it to be over tomorrow. If anybody's from the state of Georgia on this call, please stay at home. Shameless plug. But we have to sit with that truth. We encourage people who come from different walks of life in a fearless dialogue space to really receive from one another a truth that you otherwise would not know, a truth that would require you years of relationship for it to naturally slip out of you. We create a container for people to share those stories. And then we give them time to sit with it. Because vulnerability and discomfort, they're cousins. They're not enemies. And we need to learn how to sit with that and to hear that someone else's truth can take as much space in my heart and in my mind as my own. And the third rather is to receive the shift that happens. Once you hear something vulnerable, something true and beautiful and sacred about somebody else, you can't act like you've never heard that story. At Fearless Dialogues, we have the saying, once you see, you cannot not see. And so when we talk about seeing the invisible, and when we do work with social justice advocates, for instance, we have this practice on our team. We always hang up the phone when we go through any checkout line, because we choose to see the people who are behind that cashier as human beings and not just somebody rendering us a service, making our life easy. Which now more than ever, we make grocery store runs now every 10 to 14 days. And so I kind of look forward to seeing the face through the plexiglass now, because that's maybe the only other face that I'll see besides the faces in my household. It becomes that much more important to make eye contact and to say, thank you, to read the name tag, thank you, Marty. I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you, John. Thank you, Sarah. Because literally they are endangering themselves so that my family can be fed. So when you have that moment, when you realize your own sense of vulnerability, when you hear someone's truth, when you live into your truth, receive that relationship has changed. Communicate from that place of truth telling, from that place of emotional sharing that is going to redefine your relationship with that person. And that's how we build community. We don't run from what makes us uncomfortable. There's no running from this pandemic. It's changed us indelibly. It's exposed us, but it's also an invitation to be vulnerable and to know that we're not alone. We might be alone together, but we're all in this together. And next slide, that's all I have for you today. Asante sana, which is thank you very much in Swahili, because the next most important piece of a dialogue is to hear from you. And so I just wanted us to have this shared experience of storytelling, of grieving, of processing a little bit what we're going through, which is what we help people to do in a Fearless Dialogue space, and then having a conversation about how exactly we can continue to do that as facilitators, as communicators, as animators. So yeah, any questions you might have, let's talk.
So if you would, everybody, we'll shift from the chat box into the Q&A box, and I already see someone's jumped in here, which is...
Oh, I see it, Asheo.
And Edith, you got to tell me, so our friend Edith is coming in from Kenya. You got to tell me what time it is, my friend, 'cause I have a feeling it's late. Jen, our colleague, who I think is in Chicago now, and I'm glad to know you're safe and healthy, my friend, says, how much do you recommend that we bring personal stories into our organization's communications? And maybe since you're an organizational leader, what's that look like for you, Jojo?
Yeah, so we start from personal stories. We believe personal stories to be the foundation for meaningful connections and communication. There's so many smart people out there, and we've developed ways and formulas to communicate with others. But if you are in a space where there's so much information fighting for people's attention, and there's always that question of what's in it for me. Well, if you invite somebody to tell their story, then you can bypass the why should I read your piece argument, right? Because you're inviting folks to bring in their own lived experience, especially in the diversity and inclusion space, or if you're writing towards an audience that wants to see inclusive communication, you can't get any more inclusive than inviting somebody to tell their story. Organizationally, it's a culture. It's a culture that you have to build. You have to warm up to it. And it also doesn't mean, disclosure can be manipulative if the intent is to manipulate. But if the intent is to have shared experience, then absolutely err on the side of allowing people to tell stories in their own words. And that means that, maybe shifting the angle of the writing. Usually writing can seem like it's a one-sided exercise, but really good writing draws in the reader, and the reader begins to tell their own story. And so whether it's in interactions, institutionally or organizationally, absolutely, test it out. Ask your supervisor or your team, tell me your story. Like, what recipes are you using right now and why? And invite folks to begin from their experience before you zoom out to what matters to the organization. It just makes for people hanging in there with you a lot longer than they would. And it invites the reader to engage with your piece beyond reading it. They'll share it with other people and say, I read this and this is how it made me feel. It made me think of my own story, which is really the gift of communicators.
Wonder if, I'm going to take the privilege of asking a quick question. I know we have a number of them, and we will get to them, but I wonder if this exercise that we just did, is this the sort of thing you could do within a communications department for your organization?
Oh, yeah.
Because presumably there are more than one thing that our organization does to serve our communities. And they have also been radically rendered different by all of us.
Absolutely. Like, what is the function of a communicator right now? Is it just crisis communications? What about, communications that need to go on, pandemic or not? As folks are considering what's important to them, they're reorienting their lives, and it's putting pressure on their work. I mean, it would be even interesting to do this with your team, Sean, and then to see the different ways that the different expectations that people have for communicators, right? So they'll want the communications person to be, super intellectual, right? So that's square one. Very relatable, square three. Appeals to funder priorities. And, so just map out the different roles that these constituents have for a communicator, and then the pressure that it puts on you, and then sorting through all of that and identifying, so what remains at the core? Like, why do I write? Why do I communicate? Why are we here as a team? And helping to kind of ground folks in the work. So this exercise can be used in so many different ways. So that's a very good point.
Our friend Andre, and by friend, I think he's your husband, has used the internet in a devious way. He's got a bunch of people who voted for it. So this is a question I'm going to ask you. How do you balance vulnerability and the traditional view of professionalism or keeping things separate? So if 3 months ago, we weren't talking about our roles as a parent or as a partner or a friend or whatever that may be, that's all different now. How do we balance that? How do we make space for that?
So I don't know if you remember that concept of Ubuntu that was really popular in the 90s, was popularized by Desmond Tutu during the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And so it's really a term, and Edith might be familiar with this because it's drawn from Swahili, which is also a Bantu language. It really means, I am because we are. It's like the beingness, the humanness of us all, Ubuntu, right? And so from my upbringing in Congo, I come from a culture where we really believe that you approach life holistically. So everything is it's one sheet of paper, right? If you can think back to the quadrants when you had the 4 numbers and then you had your roles, Ubuntu, ideally Ubuntu is like the seamless, untorn piece of paper, everything fits in together. And so there isn't this kind of tension between the public and the private. You show up as a full human being wherever you go. But the challenge is, we've been taught professionalism shows up like this. And I think the question to ask yourself is, if you are part of an organization that has a very defined culture of what it means to be professional, ask yourself, what's the story behind that culture? because perhaps the fear might be, we need to ensure that we are legally protecting ourselves. There might have been, an institutional history that requires us to function in a particular way, but asking why, like, what is the story behind our stance towards professionalism? Why is it that vulnerability comes against? Are there multiple types of vulnerabilities? Can we lean into one kind of vulnerability in the work that we do? Because I know the work that Andre does and the kind of communications that he does. He works for an equity nonprofit. I would say, what about telling the stories of the people in the communities that they serve? That's a way of bringing in vulnerability and connecting to the community's histories and stories as a means of telling your own. So for instance, with this really big push for economic justice for people of color and environmental justice for people of color, then you can tell the story of what it's like to be, one of the few houses in our community that puts a recycling can out every week. And it's this assumption that, people of color don't recycle, but that's not the case. So, there's ways to bring your vulnerability to the workplace and not, blow up workplace culture, but to encourage a different approach. And because communicators are our griots, you are our storytellers, finding ways to tell stories that invite engagement and minimize fear. But I don't think the two should live separately at all. We're whole human beings. We don't split each other in half to show up at work.
Megan asks us, will you please revisit the shift from exposure to vulnerability?
Yeah.
A really, really powerful idea. Really good.
Yeah. So, in French, the word embarrassed in French is humilier, to embarrass someone. But it's interesting because the root of humilier is humble or humility, right? So in humility is like, the mean. And one extreme is humiliation. The other extreme is humility. It lives combined together. And I feel like vulnerability and exposure are also on a spectrum. There's a certain sense of to humble yourself. In French is, you have to be somebody who, it would be erroneously translated in English like you're embarrassing yourself. Il faut être humble, il faut s'humilier. But to be humiliated is the same word. Il m'a humilié. The exact same word, different function, different emphasis. And I think it's what the exposure and vulnerability piece really hinges on agency, right? If I refuse to be vulnerable and someone forces that upon me, then you've exposed me, right? So you've shared my story without my permission. You've taken my truth. You've used it. It's not with my permission. Then it's exposure. But when I show up and say, I will share with you that I rank mother higher than spouse sometimes. I will share with you that, as a person of color, it's important for me to show up in spaces in a particular way, as opposed to someone saying, well, this is JoJo's truth. I'm speaking for JoJo without asking JoJo for permission. You've taken my agency and I'm no longer vulnerable, I'm exposed. So that's the way that I view that. But it's like a very fine edge. The fulcrum really is agency. But it could shift between exposure and vulnerability. It's like, am I humbling myself or am I being embarrassed? As in the example that maybe I didn't say as well with French. Does that help?
So it reminds me actually, so yes, and reminds me of some of the work, I think we talked about this when we were chit-chatting before all of this, of Trabian Shorters, who spent a lot of time talking about asset framing. And how a lot of, particularly when we're talking about communities of color, it's frequently true of folks in the social sector. We are the do-gooders. We have very nice intentions. No one's questioning our intentions or our motives, but the ways that sometimes we describe our work are more about exposure and less about, and we even use the word vulnerable. We are serving underserved, vulnerable communities. But it's, to your point, the community is not suggesting that about themselves, and probably would describe themselves quite differently when they have the agency. But these organizations that are so extraordinary and beautiful in their intents, sometimes have this sort of pernicious effect
Oh yeah.
of defining people by what they lack rather than all that they have to offer.
Absolutely. Let me tell your story. You need me to tell your story. No, I can tell my story pretty well. And the story I want to tell is different than the one that's important to you. So will you invite me to be vulnerable, or will you expose me in order to achieve an end that you might think is good for me, but that I don't want? Yeah.
So our friend Michaela has a question, and several folks are interested in the answer to this, and it is, I work for a nonprofit. How can I make more meaningful connections with my audience, both during this time and coming out of it? And Michaela, you also, if I'm not mistaken, put in the Lithuanian for thank you, which is beautiful. I'm unfortunately terrible at just reading things. If you could put it in phonetically back in the chat or in here, I'm happy to try to read it out loud. But it was beautiful. Several of you put the word for thank you in different languages. Muchas gracias, for instance. Merci in French. And don't hold me to that one. My French is awful. Achu lubai. Achu labai, I believe, Michaela. So thank you. Achu
Oh, thank you, Michaela. Sante sana. Well, I think it all starts with if you are willing to do what it is that you require others to do, sheshe, yes, then your attempt, the authenticity will come through, and it won't be manipulative, right? I think it's important, to close the distance between yourself as a communicator and the organization and the community that the organization is attempting to serve. Now, typically, most people assume that I can only connect best with people that I have the same experience with. And that's how we end up actually sallowing our work. So we will send off the only Black guy to do a communications piece on Black guys, right? Because we assume that as a Black guy, he knows what it means to be a Black guy. He can write most authentically about it. But that ends up being, cheap and very stereotypical and offensive. And at Fearless Dialogues, we drive not homogenous experience, we drive shared experience. That's why I started out with creating an experience that we could all participate in and then have a conversation about vulnerability thereafter. So just because Sean and I discovered, have a love for Afropop. Now I want you to take a good look at Sean. Take a good look at me, okay? We have a love for the same kind of music. And so before you all came on, we were jamming. Tristan was just kind of looking at us a little bit. I don't think he knew what to do, but we were jamming to good music. He introduced me to an Afro-pop artist that I did not know. And Sean,
everybody have us right now.
We couldn't be more different from each other, but we have a shared experience that immediately connected us. And I feel like I can talk to Sean just as well as I could talk to Andre, who's a beautiful Black man from Jamaica. Why? Because of shared experience. So as a communicator, if you can create shared experience that you yourself can partake in, then it brings somebody towards you, and that authenticity is there. It invites vulnerability, and it helps to overcome some of the brick walls that we hit with people thinking, you're the white savior coming in, or you're the Latinx savior coming in. It helps to deflect and diffuse a lot of that.
And I'm seeing Kelly and Lishka asking for a playlist. So that is, I happily, me, gang, I love to put playlists out into the world. I think music is a really wonderful healing thing. And that album is by Bracket. And they are a Nigerian pop band. And I will fully own the fact I was reading Americana and loved the book. I just thought it was extraordinary. And in several points in it, I find myself loving books when they make references to music. And God bless the internet. Some nerd out there, bless them, put a whole list of like all the music that was listed in Americana, and then I just went on, the Google and found this. Right, I've been jamming to Yori Yori, which is that number, nonstop. It is just a gorgeous Bracket, and that number is called Yori Yori, YORI. I'll just type it in the chat for you. Next question comes from our friend Jen, who says, follow-up question: whose story do you tell? Jojo, you can't tell them all, and it needs to be authentic. So what's the cost of telling the wrong person's story? So whose story do we need to tell, and what's the cost of telling the wrong person's story? Is there a wrong person's story?
That is such a good question. There is no wrong person story. I think maybe a question to think about, and I'll wrestle with yours. And I don't want you to think I'm just answering a question with a question. But the question to think about would be, why is it, what's at stake in wanting to choose the right story? Which then points to what are your outcomes in that piece, right? I watched Chuck Babington's virtual roundtable from last week. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch. It's amazing, and I learned a lot. And one of the things that he said was, you have to be careful between what is a lot of filler and what's news. So there's a certain sense of what we have that is the news. And unfortunately, our news culture gravitates towards the most extreme and sensational and not heard before story. That's why, I don't know if you all remember this from years ago, I think she was in Louisiana, the hide your kids, hide your wife woman, the African-American woman who was interviewed after there was a fire in her building. And if you think about it, reporters tend to gravitate towards the fantastical person of color that will give them the biggest bang for their buck in that news cycle. So that character that will outlive the story is what everybody's after. On the flip side of that character is a real human being whose trauma and shock is being used for the sake of entertainment and really being used and humiliated, right? So if what you want is shock and awe, you'll gravitate towards the same stories that we keep seeing. So that's one thing. So weigh the outcomes. And of course, it's not just your outcomes. It's also your boss, your editor, your supervisor, your all these constituents that want this piece. And the reporter who's saying, hey, we'll publish pieces that are like this. So you have to weigh that. I propose that maybe we should think about it the other way. Instead of setting up this competition of stories, which then puts us in weighing the value of people's lives, really, because our lives are comprised of stories, how about creating a container where people can tell their own story? So writing in such a way that invites someone to think about their own story when they're reading yours. And I know it sounds so much easier said than done. I'll give you an example. When I was writing my dissertation, at the time, my 17-year-old sister, she's 19 now, 20. How old is she, Dre? 20. She lived with us in Atlanta totally by choice. She decided to leave Congo and move to the States. Okay. And I was writing my dissertation, and it was such a lonely, difficult process to begin. And I decided that I wanted to write something that would be interesting enough for my 17-year-old sister to read. So if you weigh like really heady academic knowledge with something that a young adult would want to read. And I love YA fiction. So I started reading YA fiction so I could channel that into the way that I was writing about women's agency in war. So every chapter of my dissertation began with a story. And it really sounded like I was writing about the Dora Milaje in Black Panther, because I know that that's what Daniela would want to read. So how do my challenge to you as communicators is write your story in such a way people can plug themselves in. So the onus is not on you to tell everybody's story or to pick the story that's the best. And sometimes the most neutral, accessible canvas is your own. So to say, I'm going to write a piece about vulnerability, I refuse to choose a story. I refuse to do the hide your kids, hide your wife thing. I refuse to do that. I'm going to bring in human interest by allowing you to hear me and to critique me, to celebrate me, to love me, to hate me, so that you can tell your own story. Reader, come tell your story. I mean, we live in a really weird time. Like, everything's been flipped on its head. Let's flip writing on its head and see how it works. If it doesn't work, forget I said it. Don't do it again. Move on. But this is the time to experiment. So try it.
Dekendre has a question. That actually something maybe we can come back to really quickly. And I know that we're at the top of the hour, and I know Zuri's got a nap coming, so I want to be mindful of that. But maybe we can just put this in the back of your brain, something come back to grace and kindness. How do they fit into vulnerability? But before we do that, Dekendre asks, how do you support a leader who feels more comfortable being authoritative, knowledgeable, rather than what might be considered softer?
Yeah. Yeah. I get that a lot. I've had some people accuse me of being a quote unquote ball breaker, ball buster, because the assumption is that, you know, when a woman presents herself assertively, she's a ball buster. But when a man does it, oh, that's just a good leader, right? So these stereotypes that you have to wrestle with. Um, what I would ask is, you know, what is it about that person's story? Maybe ask that person, that leader, about their leadership journey. You know, how it is that they got to where they got to, and in the telling of that story, you might be able to learn the nuggets. You know, there's a reason why my leader shows up this way, is because my leader had to contend with this. Like, stories are treasure chests, right? They are, when you invite someone to tell that story, you are asking them, you know, can I go to a place of understanding with you that you don't have to share, that I don't have to hear, but I want to, so that I can get to understand you better. And maybe you might understand after they tell that story why it is that it's important for an authoritarian presentation to be first. Their story will tell you that. And their story also will help you to understand what you might not agree with, but at least you'll understand. You know, I like to tell our team all the time, you know, understanding is not predicated on agreement. You don't have to agree with somebody to understand. You know, you might be facilitating a conversation, hear some crazy things. You don't have to agree, but the fact is the conversation is happening and transformation will follow. So start with the story, and it'll help to understand why it is that that's important. And also, I also want to check. I also don't want to be idealistic and say that every story will lead to you getting what you want. Every story will end happily ever after, right? So after that storytelling moment, that leader may never change, may not shift from quote unquote an authoritarian stance to a gentle one. But it'll help you to check your own bias towards a different approach to leadership once you hear why it is that that person has chosen to lead the way that they have. And let me know when you want to get to the grace and kindness piece.
We'll do grace and kindness. We're going to go to Jen's, and then we'll do the grace and kindness piece. Jen asks, how do you recommend that we bring personal stories into our organization's communications? So much of a lot of what we're doing in the social sector is drawn, and rightly so, by data and evidence and knowledge and expertise, which sometimes are under threat right now, maybe especially right now. But how do we temper that with also having this incredible drug, which is storytelling?
Yeah. What's the organization's story? How did it start? You know, I think we cut to the quick too fast, or maybe we cut to the wrong quick, which is data and statistics. But every organization has a founding story. If it doesn't, you're a communicator. Go after, look for it. Invite the stakeholders of the organization into chronicling the founding story of the organization, and maybe you lead with that. At Fearless Dialogues, you know, we like to talk about, and I shared this with Sean and Carrie, about kind of the birth of Fearless Dialogues. You know, we came about completely accidentally after the Zimmerman verdict, and how there were riots and protests at the murder of Trayvon Martin, and the verdict of, you know, not guilty, and people were yelling at each other. People didn't know how to talk to each other. And so our founder was being interviewed, and on live radio, NPR, he was like, hey, let's have a conversation about it. And, you know, over 100 people showed up, and we sat down and we had a conversation, and no one wanted to leave. And that birthed Fearless Dialogue. So that is our founding story. And so if you can get at the founding story of your organization and lead with that, that would create an emotional tie between those who want to work with your organization and within the organization as well. People will be drawn into who you are as an organization and not just what you do. And that might be a good place to start.
My yes and to that would be, in this particular moment, there are no organizations. They're just collections of people doing their best. It's really worth remembering, right? We are not the building. You know, we have a lot of our friends in this organization. The Ford Foundation has been a major component and a major champion of this network. Darren and the rest of the team, Michelle, Erica, Fiona, they're not in that beautiful building. Like I always call it the Palace for Good on 41st, 42nd Street in New York City. That's not where they are, but the Ford Foundation still exists. It's just scattered. And that's because the Ford Foundation isn't the brick and the glass and the beautiful space. It's the values and it's the stories and it's the humans who show up to bring that work forward or have the privilege of doing that work now. Because again, if we think about deep time, that work will continue after many of these folks are gone. So I think bringing our full selves into this is really critical. And there's a wonderful opportunity in this moment to be more real and to be more humble rather than thinking about maybe that idea of humiliation. I love that. Marty has a question, and then we'll do the grace and kindness piece. And Marty says, do others have a hard time making their language accessible? So I think that's jargon. We are in land conservation, are constantly battling with overly technical language and inaccessible vocabulary. So you have your own personal lexicon. My guess is, Marty, what you really mean is there's a way you talk inside, and then you also turn around and you talk that way outside.
Yes. Everyone has that challenge. Like inside speak makes you feel like an expert. It's psychological. It makes you feel like I'm in the in crowd. I'm good at what I do. I'm using the right lingo. And also it's expedient. It's expedient to use the acronyms. You get the message out faster. It's a lot more work to communicate in a way that anyone can understand what you do. But that's also the work of being human, right? Communications is hard work. It's work that serves the ends of human beings. And if that work ceases to be accessible, if our communications exclude certain people, then we are violating what it means to communicate. And so, everyone's got to backpedal and do that hard work. Everybody's got to do it. I have to tell you, there's some people on my committee that were, a little hesitant at first at my approach to the way that I wrote my dissertation. But eventually, because they support me, they rolled with it. And at the end of it, they were extremely supportive of the end product. But I had to defend myself, and I also had to do it well, right? When you say I'm going to be accessible to as many people as possible, you're signing up for more work, and you'll have critics along the way, but you'll be vindicated when more and more audiences are reached because you bother to do what Chuck said, to cut, to edit, to bring down that 30 words to 10 to 15. There's a reward in that, but it's just going to take a lot of work, and it should be done though.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, communications, if you just go on Wikipedia and type in modern communications theory, there's a message, or there's a sender and there's a receiver. And it doesn't matter what the hell the sender wants to say. It's what the receiver hears. And hopefully the idea is shared meaning and actually a loop where there is a message sent, it's received, the meaning is understood as the sender intended, and then there is a reciprocation, right? So that someone hears back, I heard you, or in this case, I see you. Marcia asks, how can all of this be translated to communities? I'm a community leader in my neighborhood and we're quite insular. Now, how can I foster connections in a neighborhood, especially right now when I can't walk around and talk to people and meet them in person?
Yeah, I wonder, so in our community, we have a group me, and, we've been like sending each other messages. When tornadoes were going through the Southeast about 2 weeks ago, a message went out, everybody take cover and get in your basements, your hallway bathrooms or whatever. So if you have a platform like that, I would say do this with them, right? What are the 4 most important roles to this community? How do we like to show up to the rest of the world and to one another? And just invite them to get on a Zoom call. You could even go from home to home and, leave a note in their mailboxes if you don't already have like a group platform. And at a time when we're all getting online, when we are looking for things to do, when we just need a reprieve, it might be really cool to do something like that and say, when all of these roles are stripped away from us that were really important pre-pandemic, what remains? How do we characterize ourselves and have that conversation? We do this very same experiment. We've done it, with several different groups. We've done it with leadership associations. We've done it with clergy groups. We've done it with students. We've done it with bankers. It resonates really well because it's all about identity and how you choose to present yourself and shared experience in humanity. So by all means, I would encourage to try it.
And so we'll close on this. Vulnerability is a superpower. It takes a lot of courage. Yeah. But what about these other two words, grace and kindness? And I know as a trained theologian that those are words that have a particular meaning. They have a sacred meaning almost.
Yeah. So I come from the Methodist tradition, and our tradition globally is having a lot of issues, so many problems. But I think one of the gifts of the tradition is this belief that, you get grace before you ask for it and before you even want it, right? So it's this, fancy theological term. If you're a theo nerd and you want to use it, go ahead, just drop it in your next Zoom call conversation. But it's prevenient grace. So it's the grace that comes before the need for grace. And I think that, in terms of framing it in this conversation around vulnerability, have grace towards yourself. The goal of being vulnerable is not presenting the best story. Again, we're not after the hide your kids, hide your wife headline news story. Don't do that. We're after a connection, right? And so a lot of the times we're afraid to bring our story forward because we do this kind of oppression Olympics, who has the biggest story of pain, and, my story is regular. I'm just a fill in the blank. We do that so much. Your story is amazing because it is your story, period. Have grace on yourself and bring whatever you have at that moment like it is, because the person who receives your truth will be invited to share theirs, and it'll be just as cobbled together as yours is. So grace towards you first, and grace towards the person listening to you. And kindness, kindness can't be understated right now. You read stories about, before the United States kind of went into social distancing and sheltering in arms, I was watching videos of folks in high rises in Wuhan singing to each other. And then, the same thing happened in Italy, right? And then Trevor Noah did a spoof. He went out on his balcony in New York and tried to sing to people, and he was cussed out. Trevor Noah is a mess. But I was like, come on, America. Like, the world is like singing to each other and we are like, shut up. But there are rare acts of kindness that are happening right now. Like, people, when in my neighborhood, there's a little boy, he just turned 1. And for those who knew that he was turning 1, like, people went to their mailbox and tied balloons, on their mailbox. You hear stories on social media, people doing birthday drive-bys, people going to nursing homes, right? Who may not have any relatives there, but just driving by and waving. I mean, there are ways to be awful to one another, and we've seen that. And they're also wonderful acts of kindness, and we've seen that as well. So kindness is just, allowing yourself to receive the goodness from the world and then giving some of that back. And but you've got to receive it for you too. And I think that, maybe sometimes we have a difficulty being kind when we have a deficit of it towards us. So if you're open to receiving good from the world, then it might be a little bit easier to give it out. But if you're tired and hungry, sleep first, eat first. That's kindness. And then try again the next day.
That's important. And I would say we'll leave it there, except that Tara actually asked a question, Tara Chen, that I think is a great place to end. And this is, how do we hold grace, hope, and optimism when at the same time we feel so much anger and frustration over systems and practices that continue to do harm, and even more so are doing even more so at this time? How can we channel the anger and frustration that many of us are feeling right now, and personally deeply. How can we make something productive out of that?
Well, I don't think that anger is the opposite of hope and grace at all. I think that anger is a sacred emotion. Anger awakens in us that will to change things that otherwise would not be there, especially when your attention is, divided in so many different directions. Anger has a really powerful centering capability. You know exactly what you are upset at. You know exactly what's frustrating you. Now the trick is to then channel that towards action. And I think that hope is the channel. You could be really pissed off. Like I do not understand why businesses are reopening. Certain types of businesses are reopening in Georgia on Friday. I am upset. But my hope is that if we make enough noise about it today, because I'm angry enough to get online about it, then maybe it'll generate change come Friday, right? So oftentimes we're taught, that there's certain emotions that are constructive for society and others that are destructive. And anger is unfairly put in this destructive category. But anger has powerful, powerful potential. We just have to allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to feel it, to name that we're feeling it, to not mask it with anything else, and then to tap into the hope that maybe, something could change because I am angry.
I think that's the place we're going to leave it. And so I get to do this on behalf of the couple hundred folks who are with us, and just tell you, I expect, like everybody else, they fell in love with you, but I just want to tell you how grateful I am personally, and I think on behalf of all of our friends and colleagues, we are for you sharing this time and this space with us. I know you did a lot of good for me, and I think for a lot of our friends. So I am grateful. I have the pleasure knowing I'm going to get to continue to chat with you. And my hope is between Andre and I, we're going to convince you to help us in ComNet 20 in whatever form that ends up taking before too long. But in the meantime, I wish you luck in getting Zuri down for her nap. Does not look like she's going to be a willing. So I'm wishing you a little grace and kindness, and her a gentle entry into a little bit of rest so that you two can take a little time for yourselves. And we'll leave it there again. Be well, be safe. Dre, be well. Jojo, please be well. And we will talk to you all very, very soon. We'll be back in touch before too long. And in the meantime, please continue to stay safe, stay healthy. And if you're in Georgia, heck, if you're anywhere, stay home, please. You're doing a kind thing. All right. Be well, everybody. Cheers.